you kind of talked about how people will really latch on to like very particular uh, understandings of the Doctrine of Atonement, like Christus Victor or penal substitution, and how you're not a fan of that, if I understood you correctly. Can you talk a little bit more about why you're worried about people just really latching onto one particular understanding of the Doctrine of Atonement?
Yeah. So imagine you're trying to think through, you're trying to get awareness of European history, and so someone says, well, basically there are three countries. There's England, France, and Germany, and Germany was dominant, for these 500 years, and then France was dominant for these 200 years, and then England was dominant for these 300 years. And if you understand that, you understand European history, right? And you think, well, okay, well, that's handy. Like, okay, I can kind of get my mind around that, and cool. Cool. Now I have a framework for thinking about history, European history. The problem is there's some huge problems with that. One is, let's say that during that early period of dominance, where Germany was really strong, they didn't cease to be a country or cease to influence European history after the French became dominant. So that'd be one problem. It kind of makes these great big periods where there aren't necessarily periods. I'm making all this up, by the way, just as an illustration.
No, sure, yeah.
And then, what about Italy? What about like all these other countries? And is the best way to think about European history countries at all? Like, when did countries emerge? Like Italy, man, Italy only became a nation, like in the way we think of it, way late in European history. For a long time, it just would have been, Rome or Florence.
Right. Yeah.
So basically that compartmentalized way of thinking about history is bogus. It's really handy, but it's just wrong. So in the early 1900s, like 1930 or so, maybe 1920, this guy, Gustav Aulén, wrote a really popular book on the atonement, where he argued that there were three main theories of the atonement throughout the history of the church. So for the first 1,000 years, people believed that God became man in order to defeat Satan, overthrow him, make things good. And then for the next 500 years, there were really kind of two main views. One was the satisfaction view from Anselm that became penal substitution in the Reformers from then on, and exemplarism, that God became man in order to sort of inspire change in us by being an example unlike any other example, that would transform us through its impact on our heart. That comes from Peter Abelard, and then was really picked up in German liberal theology in the mid-1800s going forward. So those were the three main views. And there's a whole history of this going back to German theology in the 1830s. I trace all the history of that. But the main benefit of that way of thinking is it gives you a really handy way of thinking about the doctrine of the atonement. There are three main views. And it even more conveniently breaks up into three main periods, like in terms of the history of the church. So that teaches well, preaches well, and then if you want to add, another one, you're like, no, there aren't three, there are four. There's this other, governmental view, or something like that. You can add it, but it's just really handy, and it allows you to cut through a whole bunch of material quickly. Problem is, it's just not true. like the way that I, sketched European history.
Right.
You can find those three main views in most figures throughout the history of the church. Augustine, Athanasius, so the patristics, in the medievals, and in the reformers and current theologians. That way of compartmentalizing things is just false. And there's so much more going on in the doctrine of the atonement than those three things. So basically what I'm trying to do in all of my research is say that way of thinking about it is just false. And there's a ton more going on in Scripture and in the history of the church than those three main views would suggest.